I would argue that there's a little bit of a sort of transition in what presidents or other politicians were lying about from the 1970s through 2010. Because if you look at that list, and of course it's non-exhaustive, then you'll notice that the Nixon and Reagan and even Clinton lied about things that were sort of problematic to their political careers or their situation. And George Bush lied about something that was central to his presidency. And then we arrive at Donald Trump, and he just lies. How often? Well, on average, more than every 2 hours, 24/7 throughout his presidency. So basically 13 or 14 times a day. And now, this is sort of weird, because I don't think Richard Nixon lived up to quite that same standard, neither did Reagan or Clinton. And moreover, I think there has been a transition in the type of misinformation or disinformation or lies that politicians have propagated. And I like to call this transition, or the endpoints of the transition, as ranging from systemic lies to shock and chaos. That is to say, I think at one point in the past, even though politicians lied, they curated them very carefully. The whole point of talking about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was to convince us of an alternative view of reality. But no one, Dick Cheney, Tony Blair, George Bush, none of them denied the existence of Iraq, or thought that Iraq was a brand of purple pineapples or something. Whereas today, I would argue that what Donald Trump and other people like him are doing is to engage in lies that often do not seem to have an apparent specific purpose. I mean, Donald Trump is lying about things he doesn't have to lie about, like that he didn't spend the weekend in the White House, or that he did when he was actually golfing. Why would he lie about that? Yet he does. And when people who do this are being challenged, then over the last few years at least, I would argue that the response has not necessarily been a defense of a specific misstatement, but rather what can be called ontological gerrymandering, where the defense is not, ooh, I'm right and you're wrong, but basically, no one can be right. No one knows what's right or wrong, because the truth isn't the truth. Fact is an antiquated expression, and one man's fact is another man's lie. Those are the kind of statements we are now confronted with. And I'm arguing in a chapter that's forthcoming in the future that there has been a distinct shift in the ontology that is underlying that misinformation, the ontology of truth. And so why is this happening if we accept that? Well, this is where it really helps to go back in history and read Hannah Arendt, among other philosophers who analyzed previous episodes of totalitarianism, in particular the Nazis. And this is one of the quotes that I think is very apt today by Hannah Arendt, which is that the result of a substitution of lies for truth is not that the lies are being believed, but simply that your sense of bearing in the world is being destroyed and undermined by the sheer quantity and operatic variety of lies and misstatements and scandals that are just flooding the world, and you just can't keep up with what is going on. So I would argue that this new type of misinformation, which is so different from weapons of mass destruction, is a tool that can destabilize institutions, democracies, and ultimately can create authoritarianism. Now, that's my claim with which I'm departing to put into context what follows. I'm not necessarily suggesting that this is being done with complete sort of full intention and deliberate planning, but it is certainly the case that What we're observing now in the past, and even in the present, is associated with authoritarian regimes. I mean, Putin's Russia is operatic in its display of misinformation and complete shock and chaos stuff that is being pumped out 24/7, and the US and the UK are desperately trying to catch up with that for some reason. So, whether that's intentional or not, I don't know, but I do believe that we have a problem that goes right to the heart of democracy. Hence, I call this, or I attribute what is going on now to the knowledge dementors. So, what do they do, those people who are perhaps trying to undermine democracy? What are their techniques? Well, there's a whole bunch of them, and today what I want to do is focus on 3 of them. 3 techniques by which they operate, and some of that links beautifully to what has been mentioned previously, and I'll try and draw those links wherever possible. So, starting out with conspiracy theories. Well, you can't have an authoritarian regime, you cannot have extremism, you cannot have shock and chaos, disinformation, without conspiracy theories. And sure enough, our tweeter-in-chief has repeatedly talked about very conspiratorial notions in the context of global warming. Well, not just there, also in other contexts. I wrote a paper about that a couple of years ago, where we go through the whole rhetorical detail of some of Donald Trump's tweets and what they reveal about the underlying conspiratorial thinking. Now, there's a problem with that, and that is that conspiracism, if it's articulated in public, has fallouts. It has adverse consequences without you believing the conspiracy itself. Simply being exposed to a conspiracy theory decreases people's intentions to engage in politics or to reduce their carbon footprint. And if you expose people to a conspiratorial claim about, let's say, unemployment statistics, then the distrust that arises from that will transfer to other government institutions that are totally unconnected to that, like your local school board. Your local school board will be less trusted after you've been exposed to a conspiracy theory about government statistics. So this stuff matters. Having these conspiracy theories out there has measurable adverse consequences. So it's probably important to understand how this conspiratorial rhetoric arises. And this is where I want to make a new, relatively novel claim. I don't think that's in the literature before, namely that there are 2 ways in which you can arrive at conspiratorial rhetoric. Now, one avenue that has been researched a lot is dispositional. There are some people out there who just love this stuff. And if they believe one conspiracy, they'll believe others. And you can predict who that will be by looking at personality variables, and whatever you guess is probably true. Yeah, it's those kinds of people who do that. However, that's not the only route. There's also, in my view, and I want to present evidence for this now, there is a pragmatic route to engaging in conspiratorial rhetoric in response to a perceived threat to a worldview. And that, to my mind, has not been considered or examined at all. And I think it is quite important, especially in the context of the current political scene. Now, I'm departing here from the well-known fact shown by people over and over and over again that the more you endorse free markets, the more likely you are to deny climate change. Dan Kahan has shown that. He calls it hierarchical, whatever, authoritarian, whatever his labels are. I keep forgetting them because really it's all one thing. It's just whatever is on the right wing of politics: conservatism, free market, authoritarianism, hierarchical. That is predicting the rejection of climate science. But why? Well, I would argue that it's because of threat posed by climate change mitigation. Now, if we accept the overwhelming scientific evidence for climate change, then it is natural that if you own an SUV in a huge house somewhere in California, that is perceived as a threat to your lifestyle. Because to do something about climate change means, well, you probably have to sell your SUV and stop air conditioning your house or whatever. Or that is certainly the fear that it elicits. It also is eliciting a fear related to your worldviews because climate mitigation would necessarily entail an interference with business as usual. Something has to happen. A price on carbon, taxes, regulations, scary stuff. So if most scientists agree on that, and it scares the hell out of you, then what are you gonna do? Well, clearly then, the scientists must be involved in a conspiracy theory. Because it cannot be the case that I have to sell my SUV. So those 97%, they want the world government. Now that is the mechanism by which one could plausibly argue that people deploy a conspiracy theory about scientists in response to threats to their worldview. And in this study I want to tell you about now, that is where I arguably have found some evidence for that. So what did I do? This is a study run online in the usual manner, MTurk, hundreds of subjects. And I first asked them about the scientific consensus relating to these three issues. HIV causes AIDS, CO2 causes climate change, vaccinations protect against diseases. None of these are contested within the scientific community. They're seen as established fact, but all of them have some kind of political debate attached to them, or at least they have in the past in the case of HIV. So specifically, I asked participants out of 100 climate scientists, how many believe that CO2 causes climate change? And I do that, of course, for the other scientific propositions as well. So I get people's estimate of the consensus. Then I'm clicking the wrong button. Then I present as a statement the fact that there is a consensus. Everybody agrees that HIV causes AIDS. And now I ask a slightly different question. What do you think are the reasons for this agreement? And participants now look at these candidate reasons for the agreement, scientists independently assessing the evidence, then a few other things, and they weight the importance of those reasons. Now, what you will notice is that there are 5 of these reasons that together kind of look like a conspiracy theory, right? I mean, suppressing dissent, pursuit of an agenda, groupthink, they're following the money, whoa, that's all kind of, really hinting at some sort of conspiracy. All right, and finally, I ask people about their political views. And from here on, I will score that as conservatism, but of course it's bipolar. I could have called it liberalism. There are items probing people's attitudes either way. Here is a sample item. People are better off in a free market economy. Do you agree? Up to a point. Then there are other items that go the other way. And so I get a sense of people's conservatism. And now I want to know whether these political views have anything to do with the presumed reasons for the scientific consensus. All right, let me walk you through the data. Now, there are 3 panels here: AIDS, climate change, vaccinations. And I'm first showing you the panel for AIDS because that's where nothing happens. The gray dots are non-significant. These are pretty gray. You can barely see them. Nothing happens because there's no correlation between conservatism and any of these presumed reasons. It's just politics doesn't matter to your attitudes about AIDS, the consensus underlying AIDS. Now let's look at climate change. Boom. All hell breaks loose. Now here's the one dot. That's for evaluating evidence independently. Correlation minus 0.4. The more conservative you are, the less you think that scientists evaluate the evidence. But instead, you think, well, they're suppressing dissent, they're pursuing an agenda, they're succumbing to pressure, groupthink, they're chasing the dollars. So all these conspiratorial things all of a sudden are endorsed by conservatives, because the higher the correlation, the more people who are leaning conservative are likely to endorse those reasons. And now let's look at vaccinations. Well, similar pattern, but not quite as strong. Now, if you look at the difference between the evidence versus conspiracy, how far apart the last dot is from all the others, then it turns out that the extent of that difference links very nicely to the known magnitude of the association between conservatism and the attitude towards that scientific proposition. So for climate change, conservatism has a correlation with climate denial of about 0.7. It's huge. Vaccinations, far less, only 0.2. And that maps totally into the conspiratorial presumption underlying the scientific consensus. So that suggests at first glance, that maybe what is going on here is that, as I expected, the more your politics mandates that you have to explain away a consensus, the more you will endorse these conspiratorial reasons for the consensus. Now, what is supporting this, at least indirectly, is the next set of correlations. This now is correlating people's endorsement of the various reasons for the consensus, not with their political attitudes, but with their dispositional conspiracism. I also administered a questionnaire in this study where people had to sort of endorse propositions like, dark forces run the world, tick, or whatever. And we are not in control of what's happening because there are only 3 people in the Bilderberg group that are determining everything that happens in Sweden. So, tick, if you endorse that, then you're high on conspiracism. Now, what you see here is very interesting, because all of a sudden, there's hardly anything happening with climate change. There's a huge amount happening with vaccination. Now, these are the same people overall in the experiment. This is just showing that their conspiratorial disposition is not necessarily triggering conspiratorial denial. And again, the magnitude of this is completely in line with what we know to be the association between conspiracism and climate denial from the previous literature. So what is happening here? Well, what I think is happening here is that people deploy conspiratorial rhetoric on the basis of pragmatic considerations. Political views are the strongest predictors of attitudes towards science, generally, unless you also measure the CRT, in which case that might be even stronger. But in everything we've done, political views are the strongest predictor. And whenever that mandates the rejection of science, these data suggest that then conspiracism is deployed as a tool to explain away the scientific consensus, or to explain it as a conspiracy, not as the result of independent gathering of evidence. So I would argue that in many circumstances, when people tweet about, global warming, that is not necessarily a dispositional reflection on them always believing any conspiracy, but just a convenient rhetorical device. Now, like everything else, and I mentioned this earlier in the discussion, there's a lot of signaling going on here in this domain, that a lot of endorsement of false news, fake news, doesn't necessarily reflect actual belief, but more a signal either of tribal identification or, in this case, of just explaining away something inconvenient. Now, I would argue that that's good news, because dealing with that is much easier than dealing with a dispositional conspiracy theorist. Now I want to move on to the next thing, and I want to talk a bit more about Donald Trump. Because conventional wisdom is that the media are the principal agents of agenda setting. There's a lot of literature on this, and it's all predating 2017, because all of a sudden, oops, we have Trump and we have Twitter. What does Trump do on Twitter? Well, Trump does a lot of things on Twitter. Here's a taxonomy offered by Lakoff in 2018. I don't have time to get through the whole thing, but what I want to focus on instead is this idea of diversion. That is, that what Donald Trump is doing is to throw out these shiny objects that are distracting people from what's really going on. Here was one example that we reported in the paper a couple of years ago, but it was entirely anecdotal. This was about Trump's Twitter tirade against a Broadway production of Hamilton. I don't know if you remember that incident. You do? Okay. You don't. Okay, well, basically what happened was that there was a bunch of actors on Broadway who said after a performance, oh, please, America should be diverse. And the vice president-elect was in the audience. And Trump took it upon himself to be insulted on behalf of the vice president, and he unleashed this Twitter storm, blaming the actors and producers and calling it a lousy show and all that. And if you look at Google Trends for that time period, which records the number of searches that the public is making, then Trump Hamilton had an incredible spike around that day. Now, here's my question to you. What else happened on that day? You remember the Hamilton, but you don't remember what else happened on that day, do you? No one does? Well, it was the day on which Trump settled a lawsuit for $25 million, including a $1 million penalty over his Trump University. That happened on the same day. It was reported in the paper, in the papers. No one paid any attention because if you look at Google Trends, this is the blip for Trump University settlement drawn to the same scale as Trump Hamilton. That's why we thought, hang on, guys. What's going on here? What's he doing? Why Trump Hamilton? Well, maybe because he was going to deflect attention. So how systematic is this? I now want to tell you about a study that's winding its way through the pipeline of publication, where we're trying to see whether this is systematic. And we're operationalizing the study by examining media coverage on an issue that's harmful to Donald Trump. We then would expect that to lead to him tweeting about something different. And then if that's really good and successful, then maybe the media will drop the issue and the public becomes less interesting, which would be amazing if he could do that. We operationalized this specifically by looking at coverage for Russia and Mueller. We counted the number of times he then tweets about jobs, China, North Korea, wall, immigration. These are all keywords that are his strengths. He talks about jobs a lot. He talks about beating China. He has, Little Rocket Man in North Korea. And of course, the wall, immigration is his thing. And then we look at what happens to media coverage the next day for Russia and Mueller. So we looked at all of the New York Times, ABC Evening News headlines, and all of Donald Trump's tweets for the first 2 years of his presidency. And there are two questions we want to answer. The first one is, does Trump distract? In other words, is he triggered by New York Times or ABC News coverage of Russia or Mueller? And the answer is yes. In this table, what I'm showing you are just regression coefficients. They're numbers. Never mind the numbers. The stars are what's gratifying. That means they're significant. The more the New York Times talks about Mueller, the more he tweets about some of this other stuff. Second question, does the distraction work? I mean, who cares if he tweets more, right? I mean, that would be kind of, yeah, okay. But does it actually have an effect? And these data suggest that it does. Now, there's a lot of numbers in this table, and I'll keep going through this because it's quite interesting data. The first thing to note is that there is an autocorrelation from the day before. So if the New York Times talked about Russia yesterday, they'll talk about it today. Yeah, right. That's the sort of ballistic inertia that goes with newspaper topics. So there are these positive correlations. But now look at that row. Lots of stars, lots of numbers, and minus signs. The more Trump distracts, the less the New York Times the next day reports on Russia and Mueller and ABC headline news. We find this effect with jobs, China, North Korea, some of his favorite topics, but not for wall and immigration, even though we thought ahead of time we would. So that then made us think, we have to do a little bit more. We have to expand the robustness of this phenomenon that we may have discovered here. So what we then did was to examine the entire Twitter vocabulary of Donald Trump, excluding, as is standard practice in this text corpus analysis, stop words, rare words, names, and the keywords Russia, Mueller, and collusion, because we're not interested in him talking about Russia, Mueller. We want to know if he's talking about something else more. And we also examined neutral coverage for comparison. So now I have to explain what we did before I can show you some really cool graphs. But to understand the graphs, you have to understand this. Now, as before, there are two regression models here. The first one is how much Trump tweets in response to New York Times coverage of Russia Mueller, plus about 100 and something control variables. Ignore that for now. And we're concerned about the estimate for that regression coefficient. And the second model then, and then we plot that. Well, actually, we plot the t-value on the x-axis. I'll go through this slowly to make sure that you're comfortable with it. And the second thing we're interested in is what happens to New York Times Mueller Russia coverage the next day as a function of that tweet the day before. And we plot that over on this axis. Now we do this for every single pair of words in his tweets. The pairs, it turns out, are sufficient to uniquely identify the content. I have independent evidence for that. And we now have like 1,000 word pairs. We have 1,000 different things that Donald Trump can say on Twitter. Here's one of them, arbitrarily called X. Here's the second one. There's a third one. The location of each point is determined by how much it was triggered by the New York Times and how much along the vertical axis, how that then suppressed coverage the next day. Now, if absolutely nothing happens, then we should have a blob of points in the middle centered on 0. That just means, he tweets, the New York Times has coverage, and nothing has anything to do with anywhere else. And the reason there's a large number of points is because there's a large number of different pairs of words in his tweets, and we do the analysis for every single pair. Now, if, however, he diverts and is successful in that, then we would expect to see a blob of points over here. They're to the right because he goes and tweets, and they're below the 0 line because the next day the New York Times softens or reduces its coverage of Mueller. And we should observe that statistical effect, that signal, notwithstanding having all sorts of, as I said, more than 100 control variables in there for week and time and God knows what else. So, let's see if this works, shall we? Now, we started out by looking at gardening. Why gardening? Well, because we couldn't think of anything less political than the New York Times talking about gardening. So the New York Times talks about gardening, then nothing really should happen. And nothing much happens, except that Donald Trump seems to go to sleep because there's a lot of stuff to the left, but hardly anything on the right. That means he's tweeting less. The red lines are the significant bounds. And I hope on my screen this looks great. And I think, yeah, now you can sort of see the point cloud. All right? Now for comparison, to further interpret this point cloud, we generate a null distribution. It gets to be a little geeky here now. You know, there are words like 2D Gaussian kernel. You can ignore all that. Basically what we did was to randomize the timeline of the tweets and superimpose that distribution on the actual distribution in these contour lines with a 95% significance outline. And this confirms what you can see anyway, which is that there is not much of an effect. Most of the points are where you expect them on the basis of chance, except, you know, he doesn't like gardening a lot. He's tweeting a little less whenever the New York Times is talking about that. Okay, so much for gardening. What about other stuff like the economy? Well, we looked at the economy, and this is where it kind of flips around a bit. New York Times talks about the economy. Donald Trump starts tweeting like mad. I mean, you know, there's a lot of stuff happening over here. But there's really no effect on the New York Times the next day. These red dots here are kind of, there's only 4 out of 1,000 or something. Not terribly concerned about that. What about skiing? Nothing happens, as you would expect. Right? Donald Trump doesn't care about skiing. He also doesn't care much about vegetarianism. Yeah, there's absolutely nothing happening. Whatever Donald Trump tweets in response to neutral items does not affect subsequent media coverage. Everything is sitting in the middle. So there's just chance, just a blob of points. What about Russia Mueller? Boom. We now have that cluster of points over here that we've never seen before. These are the points corresponding to Donald Trump tweeting in response to the New York Times talking about Russia Mueller and the New York Times reducing its coverage the next day. Significantly reduced coverage after a significantly enhanced distractive tweets. If you now analyze the points here, each point is a pair of words, remember that, then you will find in there a lot of the stuff we started out with, namely all his issues about jobs, China, North Korea, and then, I mean, there's lots of other stuff. Funnily, not wall and immigration, but a whole cluster of points where he's distracting the media from doing their job. Is it just the New York Times? No. The same shows up for ABC News. In fact, what happens is, if you compute the correlation between the New York Times and ABC News, that correlation is around 0 for pretty much any coverage. Vegetarianism, gardening, skiing, economy, China, all that stuff is uncorrelated, funnily, between New York Times and ABC News. They're not in sync, except all those points are. They correlate about 0.8 all of a sudden. So not only is he suppressing coverage he doesn't like, he's also synchronizing the media. They both leading media outlets become correlated by the diversion. So we believe on the basis of these data that Donald Trump strategically deploys distraction and diversion in response to coverage he doesn't consider, or he does consider, threatening. We also did an analysis for Brexit, and we found no suppression effect, even though Brexit shares a lot in common with Mueller in terms of exogenous control and ongoing coverage in the media and all that. But it's not threatening to Trump. And the diversion works. They reduce inconvenient coverage. But, you know, here's the good news. They don't have to. right? They're choosing to do that. They don't have to. So maybe they can learn not to be diverted by Donald Trump, but to ask, hang on, he's tweeting about Hamilton. What really happened in the world today? Then you look around. That's what I do. Every time I see a bizarre tweet, I start looking at I then start looking, not for his tweets, but for what actually happened in the world. And usually there is something. What's that? Buying Greenland was a good one. Yes, yes. Don't get me started. So that's the good news. And now I want to turn to my third aspect of what the dementors of knowledge are doing. And to do so, we must talk about Facebook. Now, there are some things in life that should worry you. And I haven't mentioned them yet tonight. Because none of that stuff matters as much as what I think matters in my third part of the talk. Now, it is well established to my satisfaction that if you know 300 Facebook likes of a person, that then having the proper machine learning algorithm at hand, you can identify a person's personality with greater accuracy than their own spouse. Okay? So if you want your spouse to know you best, like less than 300 things on Facebook. Otherwise, Facebook will beat you. Here are the data from this massive experiment done by Yu et al., published in 2015. And down here, if you go to 300, then you can see how the algorithm is above a spouse. I think with 10 or 15, Facebook beats a work colleague. Friends need about 50 or so. So Facebook knows your personality. And we know that they know because they filed a patent application in 2012 to, it was filed in 2012 and it was issued in 2014, and it is called Determining User Personality from Social Networking Systems. Why would Facebook want to do this? Well, they're very honest about it. They say the inferred personality characteristics are stored in connection with the user's profile, may be used for targeting, ranking, selecting versions of products, and various other purposes. So, yeah, this is in broad daylight. They use your personality to target you. With what? Well, with advertisement, sometimes of a political nature, and we know that works based on this study by Matz et al., who conducted a study on Facebook with more than 3 million participants. Now, what they did was to design ads for cosmetic products that were designed to appeal to extroverts or introverts. There's a long song and dance about validating that that is actually the case. And they then selected the audience to which these ads were addressed based on their likes, because they knew what extroverts like and what introverts like. And you can place an ad on Facebook based on those characteristics. And so the people who were extrovert got different ads from the people who were introverts, or the ads were flipped around so they're mismatched. That was the point of the experiment. Just to illustrate this, now that I've told you, you'll probably be able to guess which of those is an extrovert on the left, introvert on the right. Makes sense? Yeah, of course. Now that you know it's easy to pick. And here are the data from that study. Now, their data consisted of click-through rates and conversion rates. That is, people actually buying stuff, right? So they targeted introverts in green, extroverts in blue, and the ads were either introverted or extroverted. So it's just a fully cross design. And effectively, this here is, well, it doesn't say dollars, but it could do. Because really, that's conversion rates. This is people actually getting to the point of purchase, and they have a column in their table that looks the same, that is actual dollar amounts. And so to maximize your profit, clearly, what you want to do is to send extroverted ads to an extroverted audience, get a significant difference in purchasing behavior. Conversely, for the introverted audience, introverted ads convert better than the mismatched ads. So the targeting based on personality works. Okay, that was lipstick. You know, does that matter? Well, not so much. But I think there's some serious implications for democracy in this. Because you have information as an advertiser that allows you to micro-target people and exploit their unique vulnerabilities. If you know what likes relate to what personality, and that is in fact more or less public knowledge, then you can place ads on Facebook that are targeted at people who you understand possibly better than their own spouse. And of course, we all know about Cambridge Analytica and the scandal that's arisen from that, and how that was related to Brexit, and you know, it goes on and on and on. But interestingly, it goes on and on and on and on and doesn't stop until 2 weeks ago. It is still happening. This is an op-ed from the Washington Post by somebody who worked at Facebook and is understanding what is going on to how we're being manipulated. Because the problem here, and this is, in my opinion, underappreciated, that's why I'm going through it before I tell you about one more experiment. The problem here is that this placement of ideas that are micro-targeted and that no one else knows about undermines the concept of a free marketplace of ideas that is crucial for democracy. Because democracy relies on people rebutting each other's arguments, and the public is supposed to sit there and kind of adjudicate. Well, you can't do that. If one candidate is talking to one person, exploiting their vulnerabilities to manipulate them into staying home and not voting because they're black and poor and would probably vote for Hillary Clinton. If that's happening and the opponent doesn't know it, you no longer have a democratic debate, but you have manipulation. And the UK Parliament, in a report, I mean, they tend not always to be that outspoken, referred to Facebook as a law-breaking digital gangster earlier this year. And that's actually in that report. So what do we do? Well, obviously we gotta, you know, there's lots of political work to be done, regulation, breaking up Facebook, you know, same way as the Bell Company in the 1970s, all of that. But in the meantime, what do we do? Well, in the meantime, we can do a little bit. We can do something along the lines of what Thomas was talking about earlier. We can teach people to deal with this. We have a project going by we, I mean people at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. And our approach has been to reverse engineer this micro-targeting by boosting users' knowledge about themselves. The idea is, well, while Facebook is doing this, can we at least protect people by telling them what is happening and how they might detect that they're being targeted? So we ran an experiment. And there were two conditions. People were assigned to it at random. This is the usual thing online. Lots of participants. I don't know, hundreds, pre-registered, all that jazz. So I think the data are pretty reliable. And in one condition, the experimental condition, the boosting condition, we administer the extroversion-introversion scale, and we then give people feedback on that. You're an extrovert. I'll show you in a minute how we did that. In the other condition, we give them something called the Affinity for Technology Interaction Scale, which is about as unrelated to anything as you can think of. And it's kind of like, you know, do you like mobile phones? Yeah. Okay. We then give people feedback on that. So that's a control condition. Obviously, this is a condition where people are selectively informed about that aspect of their personality. And then there's the crucial measurement. We present ads, the same ads as from Matz et al. We use their stimuli. We present these ads to participants, and their task now is to say whether or not that ad is targeting their personality. That's the task. And we know their personality, and we know what the ad is targeting, so we can measure their accuracy. We can express that as an accuracy score. And of course, at the end, this is sort of, should go without saying, these guys get the other scale, they get the crucial extroversion, introversion scale, so we can classify those participants accurately. We got to know what the participants are. And now here's the feedback. We tell people what extroverts are after we take one or the other personality scale. Blah, blah, blah. It goes on a little. There's more. There's also introverts, right? And we tell them, hey, it's great. It's great to be an introvert. It's great to be an extrovert. It's all good. It goes on. And after the explanation, they get personalized feedback. And it looks like this. So if you're an extrovert, then you might see something like that. Oh God, there's a spelling error. You are more extroverted than 74 people of your age. And here are the others that are even more, blah, blah, blah. If they were introverted, we flip it around, so it's always to the right, but we label it differently. You're more introverted than 98 people of your age. All right? So that's the feedback. And then the classification thing is like that. Here's the ad. Do you think the ad is targeted at you? Yes or no? It's as simple as that. And there's a whole bunch of, there's like 10 of them with 12 or something. It goes on. Takes a few minutes. People rate that. And here are the results. On the right is the control condition where they learn nothing about their own introversion, extroversion scale. The way to read these violin plots is first to note that that's the median, the thick line there and here, and the violin, it often looks like a violin. It's just some sort of distribution, representation of the distribution in that condition. And now look at the personality feedback condition. People on average are 90% accurate at detecting when they're being targeted, compared to just barely above chance in the control condition. We boost their ability enormously, and look at how many participants are 100% accurate after boosting. And it takes about 4 minutes to give people the scale and give them the feedback, maybe 5. So people can readily learn to detect advertisements that are directed at them based on their personality. And then once they've been given that, their performance improvement in noticing that they're being detected is amazing, I think. And arguably, that could be the first step towards resilience. Once you know that you're being manipulated, you may not be quite as likely to believe what it is you're being shown. We hope that's for the future. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's see. We have 5 minutes or so. Let's see if we have energy and air left here. We do have some energy. Gordon, Eric. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so fond of this.
One thing I wanted to mention was, so at the start of your talk, you talked about kind of the Overton window. That is a lot of falsehoods will have like downstream impacts on how people judge. And so we did an experiment on this, I want to tell you about, where we just gave people proportionally lots of implausible things or proportionally lots of plausible things.
Yeah.
And that did change the extent to which people would judge the same statement as being plausible.
Right.
That is, if you get more implausible things, something that you would have judged to be plausible is judged to be more or implausible is judged to be more plausible.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's cool. I have one question about the proportion items in the climate change study. So how many people actually endorse those like was it 5 categories?
You mean in the consensus study?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that one thing that I shifted gears entirely.
These conspiratorial.
Yeah.
I mean, to what extent were they up on the? It was a graded scale.
Yeah.
So it was. I forget how many points. It might have even been a slider from 0 to 100. They had to, sort of estimate the importance of these relative to each other. They saw them all at the same time.
To each other. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And so the absolute numbers are very hard to interpret. I was more interested in the driver of that.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Oh, and can I just comment on your the Overton Window study? We tried. I've run 3 studies where what we tried to do was to actually induce, actually undermine people's belief in the truth by being exposed to shock and chaos disinformation in large doses. So we ran this experiment where they got a WhatsApp message every half hour for like a week. That was just chaotic disinformation. And in one condition, in the other condition, it was different. And then we had lots of measures at the end, blah, blah, blah. And what we find is that, it's a little bit different from your result, that yes, we can undermine belief in a factual event. We used the MH17 downing by the Russians, except dressed it up so that it was disguised. So people in the shock and chaos disinformation no longer believed that the Russians were responsible, whatever that fictitious country was called. But we found no effect on their underlying acceptance of the notion of truth. And we've run that experiment now 3 times in various different contexts, and it's always the same result. In that, and I think that's a dosage effect. We just cannot do enough. We cannot simulate Donald Trump in an experiment. It just can't be done. So
I'll just there's one difference, which is in our context, it's within when they're making judgments about the plausibility of statements. It's kind of in a set of statements.
Right. So you get a context effect. Yeah. Sure.
Thanks. It was great. I just want to somehow add cynicism to the very positive presentation. The resilience effect, the last study that you were talking about, where you're hopeful, the hopefulness confused me.
Okay.
And that's just because I would have thought that the main predictor of people's long-term belief was going to be something about exposure and the amount of time exposed. And one thing that you didn't mention, or there's a couple things. I know it's the first study, but what are people's attitudes towards having ads that are targeted to them? Is it making them look at those ads more? Lots of these websites say like, turn this on for personalized ads, and I don't know what people's responses are, but presumably they wouldn't be so upfront about that.
Yeah, we have a. Yeah, okay. We've got a survey done in 3 countries, Germany, the UK, and the US, where we asked people precisely those questions you're interested in, which is, how much do you accept personalization and on what basis? And it turns out that people appreciate personalization for their next movie or restaurant, that sort of thing. They totally do not like personalization for political ads. What is quite encouraging and surprising at first glance is that does not seem to differ much by politics. Certainly in Germany and the UK, that is bipartisan. People do not like personalized political ads. And if you then ask on what basis customization is permissible, you also get amazing agreement. For example, people don't like it if you're being customized on the basis of a death in your family. They think that's kind of no. But they're okay for themselves to be targeted on the basis of their preferences for movies and that type of thing. So we have a whole, gradient of invasiveness of customization. And again, that's bipartisan. There is as yet no political polarization on that as far as we can tell. So that answers part of your question. What it doesn't answer is how much time they spend and how much they engage with the ads. But we do have these data, just haven't looked at them.
The worry for that is just, whether you call it fluency or illusory truth
Sure.
or Spinoza, and like it
Yeah.
looks like that it's not going to stop the engagement unless it's a selective exposure thing where, it's going to cause them to look at whatever the...
I think there are two issues here. One is engagement. Will I still click and buy that lipstick if they're trying to target me? Which some people, if they don't like being targeted, they might not. But the other question is, will it still have an effect even if I know I'm being manipulated? And that is, and that we don't know yet. That's down the road. There are conflicting views on that. I mean, Gordon's data suggests that, so long as it's familiar, even if you know it's false, then you click or share or whatever you do, right? I mean, in a nutshell. But on the other hand, we also know that if you make people skeptical of information up front, they are quite capable of dismissing it. And not only that, they're also then subject to revision or debunking. Skepticism or not wanting to know is a great precondition for subsequent correction.
Let's talk about it later.
But that's an open empirical question, a very interesting question that we're working on.
Yeah, thank you. I was kind of surprised by your findings about the newspaper coverage on the Mueller investigation.
Yeah.
That journalists actually decided to drop that story in response to Trump's tweets, and because, as you mentioned, they don't have to. My question was, first of all, how would you explain that they actually choose to drop the story? And secondly, because what I would expect is that they would just remove the story from the front page, maybe to
we scraped all the content. We've got the entire New York Times for 2 years, and there are fewer articles the day after he distracts. Yes.
How would you explain that?
Well, there are some other... Well,
consideration be?
how would you explain that? I mean, editors make decisions all the time, okay? There are other data in the context of climate change, for example, showing that the number of editorials in leading newspapers in the United States that are pro versus anti-climate science is a function of that preceding summer's temperature. Now, I don't think the editors, and it's a strong effect, okay, and this is across USA Today, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. It's quality, varying quality, but quality papers, not Breitbart. Are these editors sitting there and thinking, ooh, it was hot yesterday, I'm not going to run this pro-science piece? No, I don't think so. I don't think they're making a conscious decision. But that doesn't mean that they're not driven by the context. We know that. People make decisions based on variables they're not aware of.
Have you considered looking at front page news only, so that I would expect an even stronger effect there?
Well, now that's a good point. And we could, front page, do we even know that in this day and age? I mean, okay, the first web page. Okay, maybe.
Well, there's usually sometimes there are digital versions of the physical newspapers.
I know. We probably have that information in there, but we haven't. That's a good point. So but there's all sorts of data out there on showing how variables are driving editorial decisions that you would think, oh my God, do these editors not know what they're doing? And I think the answer is, actually they don't. Right? They're making decisions sitting there on the basis of 1,000 variables, from the temperature outside to whatever Trump tweeted about yesterday. So, I mean, it's amazing that it would happen, but it does.
Isn't it just replaced by an article about Trump's tweet?
No, we looked at that, and it gets to be very complicated statistically because we can't disentangle that from the autocorrelation in the topic itself. I showed you, this is now a little bit complicated, but I showed you before how there's day-to-day rollover of coverage for Mueller. And that's simple inertia in the topic, right? Now, any topic has that inertia. If there's an article about China today, there's more likely to be an article about China in tomorrow's newspaper than if there hadn't been one today, right? I mean, that's just the way it...
But they probably report about Trump's tweet. And, I mean, then
Okay, that...
I mean, if you publish a certain number, then that story may be delayed.
Yeah. We tried to look at that, whether the newspapers shift attention to what he's tweeting about, and that we weren't able to pick up. And I think it's because you cannot detect that signal from the autocorrelation. That I mean, that's my best explanation for that. And whether they talk about his tweets, that's extremely difficult. Yeah, I know what you're saying, but no, we haven't done that because this is difficult enough as it is. And to get at that, you would have to have a much more intelligent text analysis, and we have played with that, but no. Sorry.
We have now 5 people on the list, and I draw the line here. So first part.
Yeah, two questions or remarks. The first one is you said that the denial of the relevance of the distinction between true and false
Yes.
statements is associated with authoritarianism.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're right. Basically, I think you're right. And
Yeah.
this was the same strategy applied by Hitler and
Yeah,
the Nazis.
of course.
Right. But I can tell you, the other day I got an email by a historian.
Yes.
I'm not proud of that guy, I can tell you. And he said to me, he was concerned by my concern that there is a drop in the respect of the distinction between true and false. Why are you concerned about this? It's undemocratic to be concerned about
yes.
the distinction between true and false statements. And why did he think so? Yes, because
Cool.
then you are denying people to raise their own
Yes.
opinions.
Yes.
Everyone should be entitled to have
Yes.
any truth holding that they want to. And that's
love it.
That's the opposite to authoritarianism. But I think he, without knowing it, it's an instrument for
Precisely.
authoritarianism.
Oh,
That's the first
totally.
question. Right.
Totally. This is
but
wonderful.
this is also
Yeah.
a position. It
Yeah.
could be mentioned a left-wing position turning to a right-wing position. That's the first question. Then
Hey! Yes.
the second one is you said that people could be nourish conspiracy theories of pragmatic reasons.
Yes.
And that could be a rhetorical device. They don't really believe in this, but it's tactical.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you have any instrument by which you could sort this out, whether people are sincere in their conspiracy theories or
Okay.
not?
Okay, yeah. Well, great question. Let me turn to the first one. I mean, I think, and I always get slaughtered when I say this, but I'll say it anyway. I think that the dirty little secret of left-wing postmodernism is that its ontology of truth has its origin in fascism. Because if you look at the fascist ontology of truth, I hate to tell you this, but it's uncomfortably similar to social constructivism and multi-perspectivism. And I've just written a chapter about this, which a lot of people won't like. However, having said all that, Bruno Latour, you're familiar with how he's... Well, no, but I mean, he's recanted. Exactly. So there's a lot of, but your historian friend hasn't got to Latour's level of maturity yet, I think. And... but I think that goes to the heart of this issue about, the knowledge dementors. It's not just people who are lying. It is also people who are providing the intellectual tools, the fertile breeding ground for this kind of stuff. And it's a real problem because when I then talk to these social constructivists and postmodernists, whatever you want to call them, they say, oh, no, but no, we never meant that. And I don't think they did, in fairness to them. And I also think that, in fairness, a lot of knowledge is socially constructed. Okay? And you can argue that, in fact, it is social construction that is the answer to the post-truth world, because once you look at how these competing bits of information are constructed, you will find out very quickly which not to believe and which to believe. So I'm not totally against this whole social constructivism exercise, but I totally agree with you that there's a huge problem there. And we haven't looked at that in enough detail. And to your second question about how can you tell whether or not somebody is sincere about a conspiracy theory outside the experiment where I showed that, well, I think that there's some diagnostics. The first one is whether people also believe other conspiracy theories. If they believe any conspiracy theory under the sun, then I would argue, okay, that's probably dispositional, and you might not have a lot of luck talking to that person. Because, I mean, these people are self-sealing. There's a whole literature on the self-sealing epistemology and all that. So that's a good marker. Do they believe in other conspiracy theories? And then the other thing to do is to just ask them to bet on their opinion. It's very easy. Money makes people incredibly honest. Are you willing to bet $1,000 on global temperatures going down next year? Right? No, they don't. Well, I wrote a paper on betting that's out there, betting on climate. And we looked at that, and it turns out that all these vocal climate deniers will never put money on their opinions. I wonder why.
Thank you for your inspiring talk. I was wondering, with regard to micro-targeting research, if I remember correctly, the work of you and others, I think those algorithms were exceptionally good for predicting openness to experience, if I'm correct. And I was...
Yeah, okay, keep going.
And I was wondering if people were also, like in your research, were differing in accuracy of like understanding when they are micro-targeted, I mean with respect to which dimension. And if so, maybe we can't be so vigilant all the time, so maybe it would make sense to like teach people to being aware of being targeted to openness, because it's related to like religiosity, political stances and all that.
Okay, so to answer the first question, yes, Matz et al. Ran 2 studies, or 3, and one of them at least involved openness as another personality dimension. But one study was exactly the one I talked about here. We focused on extroversion, introversion. I honestly can't tell you why. I mean, we just said, well, this is an easy scale to administer. We know a lot about it. And we had access to those stimuli by Matz et al. We just haven't bothered, in a sense, to do it also for openness, because this is more of an existence proof of the training capability. And you asked me then how successful this is. Are there some people who are not affected by this? Well, yeah. I mean, the outline here is the entire distribution of data. And you do have a tail down here of a bunch of people, you know, who are not affected by this. But if you compare the widths of that tail here on the left and on the right, then there are far fewer people that low down after training than there are here. So this does affect all parts of the distribution, but it's not bulletproof, no. But, you know, if you could count the number of... I have another graph that has all the dots in there, but it looks a little messy with hundreds on each side. If you count the number of people below accuracy here, it's far fewer than there. Far fewer.
Hey, fantastic talk. I
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed that. I have first a suggestion in case you're interested in then in
please.
that question. In terms of people's susceptibility to these kinds of persuasion effects, there's actually a lot of research in marketing looking at how consumer. Okay, so you already Marilyn Freestat, Peter Wright, if you're interested. There's
a warehouse full of literature.
There's a warehouse full of literature. I just want to be sure you knew about it. And then my second question, I found the stuff on conspiracy theories, and particularly the dispositional conspiracy theories, interesting. You pose it as a problem, but I wonder if that bug can be turned into a feature, and if anybody's done that before. Because there are conspiracy theories, of course, around conspiracy theories, and if you inform people about that, what happens?
Yes. Okay. So, can it be turned into a feature? Well, there was a wonderful thing on Twitter. It's an anecdote, but you told an anecdote earlier today, so I'll do it too. There was a wonderful anecdote on Twitter by some guy who claimed to be an intern, a medical intern in a hospital, and they encountered a vaccine-denying anti-vaxxer mother who refused to get their infant vaccinated because, you know, it's a conspiracy by the pharmaceutical industry to make money and all that kind of stuff. And he reported this in his own story to the supervising doctor, who said, she said to him, okay, well, leave it with me. And apparently she took this mother aside, and 15 minutes later, the mother walked out with the vaccination schedule, getting the jabs for the kid. And he asked her, how did you do that? And she said, well, I told her that anti-vaxxers, that reducing vaccination rates is an effort by the Russian government to undermine American strength. And so there's your answer, right? Now, I don't know if I want to try and get ethics approval to run that experiment, so...
Maybe not with real participants.
No, yeah, but that's the trouble. These participants are actually very hard to find. I mean, the only time I encounter these people is when I write a paper about conspiracy theorizing and climate denial, and then they crawl all over me. And, but then they refuse to be tested in my experiments.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering, has there been similar studies to the one that you had with anti-vaccine, AIDS? And
Oh, yeah. Which part of that?
So
Yeah.
I'm thinking, has this been conducted in an African context, like South Africa?
Very interesting.
Because I think that this, if it hasn't been done, it would be highlighting very interesting cultural aspects of what flies and not.
Okay, well, that's very interesting because you don't even have to go to South Africa. If you go to the United States and do research on African Americans with African American participants and their attitudes towards HIV and AIDS, you get a very interesting result, which opens up a whole issue of the rationality underlying conspiracy theories and how much of a kernel of truth is required for a conspiracy theory to take hold. And honestly, I cannot blame African Americans for suspecting the U.S. government of all sorts of terrible things, because the U.S. government has done all sorts of terrible things to African Americans in recent memory. The Tuskegee experiment, for example, right? I mean, the U.S. government has done shit that is not good. Let's face it. And so if you then go to the communities that were affected by that, of course they have a completely different attitude towards medicine and all that. And in Africa generally, I mean, the pharmaceutical industry has not always acted with the best of intentions towards their African customers or participants.
Yeah, and also conspiracy theories regarding HIV and the connection to AIDS was also, I mean, it was Thabo Mbeki was actually proposing this.
Absolutely.
So I was just thinking if it had been, because it was so interesting items, and it would be so interesting to see.
There certainly has been a lot of research on Mbeki in South Africa and AIDS denialism there, and part of the conclusions there are that, again, you know, it is understandable what seeds these theories, because there's always a kernel of truth of some sort in them. And if you're affected by bad stuff that was denied, well, why shouldn't some other bad stuff be true despite being denied, right? So yeah, I'm very sensitive to that sort of cultural background and why that would invite people to believe things that we think are not true.
Yeah, and I was also curious about if this would sort of affect the scales of saying that what is a free market, if the free market aspect would sort of be linked to attitudes
in different cultures.
In a different culture.
Well, okay, with climate change, actually that goes across the board. There is a study by Hornsey et al. That came out in Nature Climate Change, I think in 2018, where they looked at 24 different countries and attitudes towards climate change as a function of various variables. And this free market thing and conservatism was pretty much across the board a predictor across many, many different countries of climate denial.
Okay,
so people have looked at that.
Okay, my question is I like your study showing that this whole fake news thing contributes to this strengthening authoritarianism. Because I find that in my study, I look into the Philippines. Fake news.
Yes, of course.
And like when you study the content and you use the Lewandowsky-Ziblatt indices for democracy, all of these contribute to these different indices, denying the legitimacy of opponents and etc. So
fascinating.
And also reinventing history and everything. And for me, it's they're very successful, whatever this the movement behind it. And my question to you is you showed here one way to deal with it is this self-reflection with your with the last study, but that applies to, let's say, consuming a product. In this way, let's say with the authoritarianism, what are your ideas for, let's say, solutions or ways to to fight
Well,
against
I wish
this?
I knew. I mean, that's what keeps me up all night, almost literally. I mean, trying to find an answer to that. I don't have a good answer, although there's a couple of things. First of all, I never have time to talk about everything, but there's data suggesting that leadership in this is extremely important. Okay. For example, among Republicans in the United States, in 2015, Vladimir Putin had an approval rating of 15%. Same as among Democrats, 15%. Okay, that means 85% didn't like him a lot. What do you think that is now? Huh? No, nearly 40, 35% among Republicans. Among Democrats, it's gone down. Well, maybe there's another poll that shows 40. But now for Republicans who spent 40 years fighting a Cold War against Russia, to go from 15% to 35% in 2 years is a remarkable demonstration of leadership. And lots of other things too. But I mean, you have to credit... you have to credit Donald Trump with that. You can also credit the Republican leadership with withdrawing from climate change, which at one point, believe it or not, was a bipartisan consensual issue in Washington. And there's work by Robert Bruley, a sociologist, showing that it was the retreat of the Republican leadership from climate change that opened up this partisan divide. It did not come from the grassroots. It was a result of leadership. So leadership is crucial. And there's other evidence. Nyhan and Reifler have run an experiment, naturalistic experiment, during an election campaign in the United States, where state legislators in one condition were sent a letter warning them that if they lie, they'll be caught by fact checkers. And in the control condition, they didn't get that letter. Now, it turns out that the fact checkers picked up the people in the control condition for lying more than in the experimental condition. So a reputational threat was enough to keep people during an election campaign from lying. Back in 2012. Whether that still works is okay. So there's a couple of things we know that suggest leadership is really important in this and could make a difference. But of course, then you got to find a leader who will do that for you, right? So that's the hard part. The other thing we know is, and I'm going back to the study I mentioned earlier by Hall et al., we know that people will only accept those lies to the extent that they feel that the system is not working for them. Okay? So, again, this populist kind of, shock and chaos will not find traction in societies that where that feeling is less prevalent. And the final thing we know is that the media culture makes a huge difference. If you look at the Republic of Ireland, Ireland is pretty much free of populism. One of the reasons, there are two reasons for that, I think. Number one is the media culture. There's work done at Dublin City University by Jane Souter and her colleagues who show that the media culture makes a huge difference. And the other difference is their citizens' assemblies. Participatory, deliberative assemblies of randomly chosen citizens that debated abortion and gay marriage before the referenda. And that, I think, prevented the issue from being hijacked by the tabloids and oligarchs and whoever else gets on the scene. So looking around the world, we know what works, more or less. But to put that into the Philippines, I don't know. Good luck. It's not going to be easy.
Final question. All right. Originally, I was going to ask Annie's question and whether you had tried betting on pragmatic conspiracy theorists, but you had. Lovely. So I'll ask something else. When it comes to diversion, you said, the newspapers, they don't have to do this, which is true. And I mean, we have all seen people in the newspapers calling for not falling for the diversions, right?
I know.
I think I read in the Washington Post and so on.
Only recently.
Yeah. Is there any kind of effect?
Well, okay, that's very, Well, I spoke to the Washington Post at length. And I mean, and a lot of journalists about this. Here's the problem. The problem is that the American media for the last 250 years or whatever, has had a tradition of covering what the president is saying. That was just their job, and that's what they did, and that's what they take pride in, and that is a journalistic norm. That worked well until Donald Trump showed up on the scene. And now they're caught because they are very reluctant to give up on this president because, well, shouldn't they cover what the president is saying, right? But they're also aware of the fact that now with this specific individual in the White House, there are some problems with that. And they don't know yet how to reconcile that. So they're not unaware, but they are in a very tricky situation. I have some sympathy for them. Now, I also think that, if you're an effective journalist, you can just say, oh, Donald Trump tweeted about something, so we had to look at the world and discovered that actually what's of interest is this. Exactly. And then you talk about that. Absolutely. And, they're getting better. They're getting better at it. But, of course, the next problem is that whatever the Washington Post does or the New York Times does is not enough. What matters is what Fox does. Okay? I mean, let's face it. What matters is what the propaganda machine is doing. And they're not going to say, oh, right, oh, thank you for telling us. Oh, gosh, gee, we didn't know. Of course they're not going to say that. They'll just accuse me of being a pedophile or something. I mean, they'll make up something else.
Did you have a very quick one? I hate to end on Fox News.
Didn't he also save journalism? I mean, before Trump, what was the state of the New York Times and what is their state now?
Oh, well, I think the New York Times probably is in better shape now. Yes, absolutely. But that doesn't mean the society is in better shape. Because, I mean... Well, of course, and certainly during the election campaign, that was totally true. I mean, Donald Trump got something like $5 billion worth of free coverage because the media were focusing. I mean, you can put a dollar value on this. There are equations for that. And something like $5 billion they spent on his campaign without wanting to, by simply covering him.
Yeah. Okay, I think it's been a wonderful, but a long day now. A wonderful day, and I really want to thank all our fantastic speakers. Ellen, Gordon, where are you all? Thomas, Daniel left, I guess.
Yes, he had a train to catch.
He had a train to catch, and now Stephen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.